Hello, everyone. I'm Julia Piper. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and a contributing editor at Green Tech Media. I'm also the host and producer of Political Climate, a bipartisan podcast on energy and environmental issues in America and around the world, presented by the University of Southern California's Schwarzenegger Institute. As a quick plug, we've had some great guests on the podcast in recent episodes, including UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, U.S. Representative Paul Tonko, Assistant Secretary for the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Daniel Simmons, as well as Arnold Schwarzenegger and Greta Thunberg and others. So I hope you'll check out the podcast from pretty much every podcasting platform. So now, as part of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center's ongoing coronavirus coverage, we're honored to be joined today by an expert panel for a timely discussion on clean energy and climate impacts of COVID-19 and the oil price fallout. As an important note, this event is on the record. We are currently live streaming it on the Atlantic Council's Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube pages. And we encourage you to post about what you hear today and share it on social media using the hashtag #ACEnergy. Hashtag #ACEnergy, and tag the Atlantic Council at AC Global Energy. That's at AC Global Energy. Now for the Q&A, we hope to make this dynamic and interactive. So if you have a question and you want to take part in this conversation, please submit your question via the Q&A portal located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It's only there that we'll be taking questions. If you're with the press, please state both your name and your affiliation so we make sure to get the question right. Now, I'd like to introduce our virtual panel, starting with Ethan Zindler. He's head of Americas for Bloomberg New Energy Finance. We also have Rachel Kite, former CEO and special representative of the UN Secretary General for Sustainable Energy for All and co-chair of UN Energy. And she's the current dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. We also have Rich Powell. He's executive director at the ClearPath Foundation, a nonprofit organization working to develop and advance conservative policies that accelerate clean energy innovation. And we have Adnan Amin, former Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency and a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. Now, as you all know, we are living right now in some unprecedented times. The coronavirus pandemic continues to loom large over the world, and in countries all over the world are facing major challenges. As consumer demand contracts, employee payroll is cut, capital shrinks, and billions of people remain in government-imposed quarantine. The combination of economic downturn, cheap oil and gas prices, and global supply chain disruptions have major consequences for clean energy development and climate action. Much is still unknown about what the pandemic means for the future of climate and clean energy. But our expert lineup of speakers are here to walk us through the latest developments and explain how they see the situation playing out. I'm going to ask each speaker to give brief opening remarks, starting with Ethan Zindler at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. First, I just want to take a quick moment to thank everyone in the medical community for working tirelessly to keep us safe, as well as frontline workers such as supermarket cashiers and truck drivers who are keeping us fed, and utility workers who are working to keep our power on and our water running. We owe an immense debt of gratitude to you all. Now, Ethan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Julia, and hi, everybody, and welcome to my attic. And thanks for the opportunity today to you, Julia, and to Randy with Atlantic Council and everybody. And I would just certainly echo your comments about our deep gratitude for those who are helping keep the lights on in this very challenging time. I'm going to talk from the perspective of Bloomberg NEF for a few minutes today, just to kick us off. Bloomberg NEF, for those who don't know, is a division of Bloomberg that does energy market research with a particular focus often on clean energy technologies. And I'm going to start really mainly by talking about renewable energy and electric vehicle impact that we've seen to date. Obviously, these are challenging times for the clean energy sector. That makes it no different, really, than many other segments of the economy overall. And from my perspective as an analyst and manager of analysts, our challenge is to try to understand what the COVID-19 impact will be on the sector, obviously in the short term and then going forward. The challenge for us, of course, is we're not macroeconomists. It's very hard for us to understand sort of the level of severity that we're going to see. So I'm going to caveat all my comments with one fairly substantial assumption, which is that we assume that this is a severe impact on the industry that lasts about 3 months per market, and that the expectation would be that the economy would start to come back to life sometime in the fourth quarter. Obviously, there are enormous unknowns, and that's only one scenario, but I did want to preface that because I think there are a lot of things that we're going to have to see how this all plays out. But most of my comments today are going to be based on that fundamental assumption. I'm also going to talk mainly about the OECD countries because I know Rachel's fantastic about talking about non-OECD stuff. And I'm mostly going to talk about conventional technologies because Rich, I think, can cover some of the stuff that's a little more out there and coming in terms of zero carbon techs. The way we see it, there's really 3 time frames to look at. One, which is the immediate current situation that we're in literally right now. There's the short-term situation through 2020, and then there's the medium to long-term, 2021 and 2021 and beyond. Right now, as I speak, we are already seeing major disruptions that COVID is causing in the clean energy sector, both on the supply side in terms of the availability of goods and services, and now on the demand side. And when this really first kicked off in China, we thought that this was both a supply and a demand side problem for the market in China alone, but a supply side problem really for the rest of the world because China is such a major supplier of in particular, equipment used in solar and batteries and electric vehicles. However, obviously, with the change in circumstances and shelter-in-place orders in a number of countries, it is becoming very much of a demand-side phenomenon as well. If you look at Italy, Spain, other parts of the world, obviously the United States, we've seen electricity demand come down very sharply in the short run. And of course, the question, which I think Julia will probably get to later, is this just a short-term issue, or is it something much more substantial longer term? To put things in a little bit of context globally, we thought that this year was going to be a record for overall wind and solar build, with somewhere around 200 to 225 gigawatts of wind and solar to be built in 2020. We now conservatively think that number is going to be 175 to 210, probably though on the lower end of that. So if you say it's 175, then you're looking at about 23% less than what we had been expecting. Although it is worth noting there was about 180 gigawatts installed last year, so you would still be talking about a year that wasn't that different from 2019. However, obviously, we will have to wait and see how things unfold and the level of disruption that we see that goes on throughout the year. For electric vehicles in particular, there are about 2 million of them sold. And, for this year, already we've seen major disruptions in demand for cars overall. And in particular in China, which is the largest demand market for cars, sales were off 45% in January and February. We also saw drops in Korea, Japan, and India. And no doubt sales are down now here in the US and in Europe as well. So that is going to fundamentally help hurt electric vehicle sales overall. We can talk also a little bit more maybe later about the impact of a lower oil price, but I don't think it's worth even getting to that level of nuance quite yet, because more fundamentally, people just aren't buying cars, and that's hurting electric vehicle sales overall. I'm going to finish with just a couple of quick comments about the U.S. because the U.S. is obviously a very interesting encapsulation of a lot of the phenomena that we've seen around the world, but last year, we at BNEF counted about $55 billion deployed into the clean energy sector in the U.S. mostly to build wind and solar. That was a record by far. And coming into this year, we were expecting a record for new clean energy build in the U.S. with about 27 gigawatts to be installed, about 14 of which we thought would be solar, about 13 wind. We now already are revising that down to assume it'll be about 22 gigawatts in total, with about a split even of 11 and 11. That's about 19% than we had been anticipating. The wind sector in particular is one I think that we keep an eye on. This was going to be an extremely busy year for wind, with an important deadline on a step down of the tax credit coming at the end of this year, and a lot of time pressure on developers to get projects done and completed by the end of the year. The last thing that they needed was any kind of a disruption in the supply chain and the lack of availability of labor in any cases. And so we definitely think this already is causing challenges, and the deadline at the end of the year is definitely problematic. The same is true to some lesser degree for solar on the utility scale. But on the solar residential side, I think it's worth pausing and talking about that for just a moment, because you're talking about a business, excuse me, where a lot of the marketing is literally people going door to door to promote and sell their services. Obviously, in a period we're in where people literally are not allowed to go out, this directly hurts the business model of a lot of the residential installers, and we do think that segment of the market is going to take a pretty substantial hit. And then lastly, on electric vehicles in the U.S., we had thought, 3 weeks ago, if you'd asked me, or maybe a month ago, if you'd asked me, we would have thought that electric vehicle sales in the U.S. would have been roughly even with where they were last year, which was about 300,000. But obviously, people, like I said earlier, people aren't buying cars, and this is something we think is going to hurt. And on top of that, there were other factors that were contributing to not necessarily going to be a great year for electric vehicle sales in the U.S. anyway, involving the capping out of tax credits that were available for certain manufacturers. So that's kind of a quick, sort of, hopefully in a nutshell, view of where we think things stand. Like I said, with the giant caveat that our, frankly, hope and expectation is that this is only a 3-month disruption, a serious one, don't get me wrong, but that we see some kind of a return to norm time in the fourth quarter of the year. If it's not, obviously, those are numbers, we'll have to revisit these numbers just like everybody will for whatever industry that they're covering. With that, I'll give it back to you, Julia. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, great. Dean Kite, I'd like to have you go next, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here, and it's always good to follow Ethan. I would add a caveat to those that he offered, which is I think the way in which we bounce back will be determined a lot by the role that the state decides to play in helping countries bounce back. That's a domestic decision for OECD countries, and for the developing world, it is a domestic decision, but it's also a decision of the international sort of economic apparatus and the extent to which that is going to be able to come in and help build resilience. So we are in an unprecedented crisis. We are in the teeth of thinking through what the relief is that has to happen at this time. And of course, the next stage is then the recovery. And that's where I think the role of the public sector in vis-a-vis to the energy sector, but also all other sectors of the economy will be interesting to watch. If we do this right, then we also need to use that recovery as a way in which to build resilience into the economy overall, and the energy systems will be a very big part of that going forward. There's a lot been said about this crisis and what we can learn in this crisis for the other crises that we face. And we know that the energy system was already on a process of revolution, of digitalization, of decentralization, of decarbonization. And in each of those, actually, there is much to be hopeful for, that the energy systems will be able to be a driver of the recovery, as well as being very clear what kind of assistance we need to the energy sector. But there's also some weaknesses therein. And for example, Ethan talking about the off-grid solar market. I mean, distributed energy will be badly hit by the current lockdown, and yet is a very, very big part of the resilience that energy systems need going forward. So I think that there's been a lot of discussion around what kind of recovery do we have in the energy sector, and where do we put the finger of the state? How do we tilt the balance? Another adage, and perhaps a lesson learned from previous shocks, although we haven't experienced a shock as profound and as global as this one, is that you shouldn't do stupid things. And so can you use the moments of recovery to speed up a shift in direction that would give you more reliable, more affordable, cleaner energy for the long run, and ease the transition, but not use public funds and not use the levers of the financial markets to prop up things that were perhaps on their way out anyway? Is there a way to make companies more resilient and more robust? Is there a way to help parts of the energy sector more than others? Obviously, we need to have a cleaner energy system than we've had now, and there's a lot of eyes on where bailouts may go, whether or not there is a propping up of fossil fuel industries, and whether or not this is a moment to speed the divestment that we've seen from the fossil fuel sector. These are all questions rather than answers, because we are still deeply in that relief part of the process. But I think it is possible to build greater resilience into our global economy. We can see now across the world that some economies are more resilient than others, and understanding their energy systems as a factor in that resilience or not will be important to look at going forward. So don't do stupid things, build resilience, work out which bits of the energy sector you really need to push forward. And I think there is no reason why short-term, medium-term, long-term need to be disjointed. So the job-rich growth that you need coming out of the crisis, where you can support small, medium-sized enterprises, where you can support clean energy companies and the clean energy transition, where you can support the continued digitalization of the energy system so it becomes more resilient, becomes more efficient. Those are all, those can all happen. I mean, that is a short-term and a medium-term package of support, either through stimuluses or recovery bills or whatever. And so I think there is a possible way to mesh a sort of cleaner, greener future with a job-rich, good recovery program for the here and now. The final thing I would say is that this has obviously had an impact on the way in which we see global cooperation. There have been highlights of global cooperation, and there have really been some lowlights. The fact that the UN system has struggled to be able to bring countries together to discuss global cooperation, and the economic infrastructure, the G20, G7, have stumbled a little bit and found it difficult to speak with any kind of clarion call to what is needed at scale. Bedded in that as well was that 2020 was supposed to be a year where we would double down on climate negotiations, and those have been postponed. But there may be something good in that, in 2021, the UK and Italy will, notwithstanding the fact that they are hard hit by the crisis right now, they will be the chairs of the global economic governance structures and the chairs of the climate negotiations at one and the same time. And perhaps, if we're good enough, this is a moment of a new kind of leadership, bringing the road to decarbonisation together with the need for a more robust economic governance.
Great. Thank you very much. All right, Rich, over to you, please.
Great. Thanks, Julia. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for having me and hosting this really important conversation. I'll cover just a couple of quick topics today, and I'll lead off in a spot that I think is similar to where Julia started us, which is to say, in my view, more than anything, this crisis has reinforced the importance of a clean, extremely reliable supply of electricity to every corner of the globe, right? So we know a couple of things about this virus. One, we know that it's much easier to get people to stay inside and shelter and self-quarantine if they've got air conditioning and Wi-Fi and television and all the stuff that electricity allows folks to do, and that's the most important thing. Two, the way to treat this virus is via ventilators, which to my knowledge are entirely powered by electricity in every corner of the world. And three, we know that this is a virus that, preys on folks with respiratory issues, right? And so clean air is just extremely important in responding to something like this. And so it's really reinforced that, to respond to this and hopefully, not soon, but to further pandemics like this in the future, that priority of universal electrification, universal clean electrification, with highly reliable supplies of power is just absolutely vital around the world. And I'm actually quite concerned, obviously, both about ourselves in the developed world who have a clean, reliable, clean, increasingly clean supply of electricity, but more so for the many corners of the world that actually still struggle with that and aren't going to have electricity at home, stable electricity to power hospitals and ventilators as well. And so that's the first point. I do think it's remarkable what folks in the utility industry in the United States are doing to sort of keep the power on. We're hearing about folks that are literally going to shelter in their power plants over the next couple of months to sort of keep themselves safe and keep themselves healthy during this time. I know that in Pennsylvania, the Limerick power plant, the large nuclear plant there, is going to refuel a nuclear power plant in the midst of all of this, which is an unbelievable undertaking. Construction continues at the Vogtle nuclear power plant in Georgia, 9,000 workers on site, some of the most remarkable sort of skilled trade folks in the country that are still building that, enormous source of clean electricity. So folks are doing some pretty heroic stuff in this moment. Stepping back, second point would be that I do think that this is a challenging moment for the climate conversation, and going a little bit beyond where Dean Kite left us with the challenges just to the specific diplomatic conversations this year. We know that around the world in public opinion, unfortunately, folks view action on climate change is a bit of a luxury good, meaning that support for robust action on climate change typically rises in good economic times and falls in bad economic times, and we saw that in the last sort of global recession. And so I'm hopeful that will be less the case with the sort of now inevitable coming recession. But I do think that we who work on clean energy and climate and innovation ought to be prepared for that, and people making tough decisions and trade-offs between these things in the years ahead. Third, I do think that there's going to be significant challenges for a broad array of clean technologies. Ethan shared a lot of the challenges in the renewables and efficiency space. I think it's going to be equally challenging in the suite of 24/7 dispatchable technologies where we spend most of our time at ClearPath. As an example, in the carbon capture and sequestration space, many of the proposed projects already underway around the world or proposed around the world rely on the idea that the captured CO2 would be used as a commodity, a valuable commodity, to spur enhanced oil recovery out of tertiary wells. And now in this oil price regime, that business model will be extremely challenged. And in my view, even if we come back to something like the former regime, where actually EOR was just about in the bubble, was already pretty challenged, folks are going to realize how fragile that equilibrium is, and I think be taking a second look at some of those investments. Thankfully, in the US, we do have a policy regime, the 45Q tax credit in place, which also incentivizes folks to capture carbon emissions and just put it underground, just sequester it. And so it's not entirely reliant on that enhanced oil recovery market. But so I think now the balance of the interests and the business models between those things has probably shifted pretty significantly. On the bright side, the continued and now even lower regime in natural gas prices, which is likely to continue now for some time, may continue to and maybe even deepen some of the coal to gas switch that we've seen, which has been so influential in decreasing U.S. power sector emissions. And it will now be even cheaper to run natural gas-fired power plants with carbon capture on them. They were already looking like a very economical, flexible zero-emission source, and they'll be even more economical still. So challenges and opportunities from the crisis. As we think ahead a bit, clearly it has not been time in the latest rounds of stimulus to think about broader measures in economic recovery. We do expect that at some point in the next stimulus packages, and we assume that there will be multiple packages ahead of us, certainly at least one more stimulus package. There's been a great deal of talk now about an infrastructure package, potentially as a standalone, potentially framed as part of one of these other stimulus packages. We do think that in the midst of all of that, there will be quite a bit of opportunity for clean energy technology. And as we look at what's been successful so far in finding bipartisan consensus in this really challenging time, it's been sort of looking at ideas that have already been pretty well supported in some bipartisan fashion before. And so somewhat tragically, an energy bill, an extremely bipartisan energy bill in the Senate was held up just before the COVID crisis began, and so didn't actually get to a vote in the Senate. But I will note that it included 17 major technology demonstration programs, all of which would have to have been completed by 2025. And in energy space, folks will know that if you've got to have it completed 5 years from today, you better have been working on it yesterday. And so there's, I think, quite a bit of job opportunity and economic development opportunity, construction, skilled labor, enabling infrastructure that would have to be built to support that wave of demonstration projects. And again, 80 senators voted to send that bill to the floor for consideration. And so that seems like a really terrific bipartisan place to start conversations about what a energy-backed, infrastructure-backed economic stimulus might look like. And I'll leave it at that.
Great. As a reminder, you can send in your questions through the Q&A portal at the bottom of your Zoom screen, just to our audience. Remember to send your questions in there and we'll start weaving them into the discussion. But now I'd like to go to Adnan Amin, please, for your opening comments.
Hello, Julia. We last met in Abu Dhabi, and what a different world it was only a few months ago. And it's remarkable the speed of global change and the impact of this crisis and how it has become global in such a short period of time. I listened very carefully to the other panelists. I agree with almost everything that was said. I especially am so pleasantly surprised to agree with almost everything Rich just said. I know he represents a conservative think tank, and I'm really happy that there is such a kind of commonality about what the diagnosis of the problem is, as well as what the potential solutions are. And I think that's the best political news we have, is that there is an emerging consensus. I also agree very much with what Rachel said, which is that this crisis has implications for how we think about governance, the role of the state, industrial policy, fraying social infrastructure, and economic decision-making capability. I think these are going to be critically examined as we go forward, and there are going to be political implications coming out of all of what we are seeing today that will impact on all of that. But let me say, I'm very pleased that Ethan was so optimistic that by the fourth quarter we're going to see a turnaround and so on. But in my view, and having a background in political economy, my sense is that we are in the midst of an unprecedented macroeconomic crisis. That we've had a series of very optimistic projections, which I understand for political reasons to keep people's spirits up. But I think that we are just seeing the beginning of a very difficult historical period in the global economy. We are now beginning to see projections of around 3 to 4% loss in terms of global GDP this year, without really an understanding of how this is going to play out over the next year. And also how every major sector that impacts on energy demand, from aviation, transportation, freight, tourism, hospitality, everything has been depressed and may continue to be depressed for a long period of time as we see certain behaviors that are now being internalized play out over a longer term. I mean, how convenient it has become to do conferencing like this rather than travel halfway across the world and spend most of that time in coffee breaks talking to people you could see at home. So a lot of that kind of rethinking is going to happen, and that may have implications in the long term for energy demand. So what that means is that we are going to see a relatively long period of depressed energy demand. We're going to see depressed investment. We're going to see large-scale unemployment as we adjust to the economic shock that is coming from these multiple crises. And we're going to see political implications, and I think more and more demand for a review of how governance is taking place and the participation of people in making decisions on governance at various levels. So that's the broad thing I see. Complicating all of this, of course, is this dramatic collapse in oil demand. In the middle of a oil war for market share between Saudi Arabia and Russia, the subtext of which is to try to kill as much of American shale production as possible in the time that's available. This is a very real possibility because you see, very highly leveraged, medium-sized shale producers who are now under tremendous pressure as their debts come due. And I think part of the discussion with President Trump about this bailout, I think one of the panelists mentioned that they were discussing a bailout, is precisely this. And the question becomes, what is the moral justification for a bailout for private sector operators who made their bets? Can we continue to have, on the one hand, a neoliberal economic policy of austerity, but at the same time constantly bail out failing enterprises that made wrong decisions at some point? So I think that issue will be important. But I believe that we will see serious implications for American shale production in the medium to long term. In the midst of this, of course, we have the resumption of the Keystone pipeline discussion. and funding being allocated for Keystone Pipeline, while civil discourse is not being allowed in the public space about this issue. So that's not a very good indicator about the future. But in terms of how this has all played out, I think I agree with Rich about one thing fundamentally, which is this shows that the future is going to be electric. And everything Ethan has been saying about the projections on capacity, we've seen actually for the 7 or 8 years in a row in the world, new additional power capacity has come majority from renewables. I think this is going to continue to be the case in the future. I think that we are going to see renewables becoming cheaper and cheaper. We're going to see enabling technologies like digitalization, enabling the penetration of this, enabling flexibility mechanisms to play a role, storage that is becoming grid competitive, increasingly playing a role, and electric vehicles becoming more and more affordable as battery prices continue to fall. So innovation is going to drive much of this rise of electricity. I think this presents a huge opportunity in 2 respects. I'll just finish with this. One is, how do we get out of this? And that how do we create a stimulus? Because right now, the 2 trillion we've done is just basically a liquidity package to keep people afloat. And it's not a stimulus package. We need to look at the number of stimulus packages. Again, I agree with Rich on that. I think that will be coming down the pike. But we need to have a very strategic discussion about where they would be going, because whatever we come out with in terms of recovery here is going to have tremendous geopolitical implications, because a number of different actors, China, the European Union, will be putting big bets on their Green New Deals, on green stimulus, green infrastructure, R&D in new technologies. And it's very important that there be a discussion in the United States to capitalize on its inherent capability and lead in many of these fields, and not to fritter that away in terms of how this shakes out in the end. But I think it also gives us an opportunity on climate. And I don't think it's because we're going through a depression or good times economically. I think people will have recognized with the advent of the coronavirus crisis that climate is an equally, if not more important, global issue that impacts people around the world, and that can be even more catastrophic than the coronavirus. That's the messaging that has to go. And I think Rachel made a very important point, that our international institutions, unfortunately, haven't been able to capitalize on this. I mean, even this year, for example, the G20 is under Saudi leadership. I really don't see a big discussion on decarbonization happening in the energy ministers meeting there. So I think that this allows us, with the delay to the COP26, hopefully Boris will be fine by then because all his political skills will be needed. But if we have a resumed COP26 later on, where we can actually get out of the rut of climate negotiations that we've fallen into, where we haven't been able to diverge from the same path that we've been on, which has no result. We need a new political impetus for climate, and I think that's possible now.
Great. Thank you all for that. I know we had a lot to cover, so I wanted to get some opening statements with some real meat to them. As my follow-up, I want to ask, Adnan, you mentioned there's some agreement here, but I'm unclear on just how bold people are talking about in terms of policies when we talk about the next stimulus here in the US and possibly other countries. Are we talking about some tax credits for renewable energy, things that are familiar, things that Rich mentioned came up in previous Senate bills? Or are we talking about a more holistic resilience investment? Are we talking about investments that have been lagging in the past to boost American infrastructure in transmission, distribution, and other aspects of the US economy? So what policies are we talking about specifically? How bold should they be? And when do they enter the political discussion? Is it this exact next bill that's likely to come up, or are we talking about further down the line? And I think that speaks to a question that came up about how long you think this crisis will last. Are we talking about a bigger reformation to the economy, or is this something that will be done with by the end of the year? So to answer a question from Alex on how long you think this crisis is going to last, and then what the response should be as a result. Dean Kite, can I start with you, please?
Yeah, well, we don't know how long it will last, and there are a number of variables in that, including the the path of the continued transmission of the virus, the public response to that, or public government response to that, and then the way in which we think about getting people back to work. So you see now, as continental Europe seems to be coming perhaps past its peak, you're starting to see the conversation shift very much to how do you unlock the economy past the virus, right? So what do you get back to work first? How do you get back to work? And then what does the stimulus look like? There is an opportunity because for the past 30 odd years, we have really sort of held back in terms of what government's role can be, especially in North America. What can government's role be in stimulating the kind of growth and the kind of development that you wish to see? And there's been a general narrative that government doesn't have that positive role to play. Well, we now know that we can print money when we have to. We now have just seen an extraordinary intervention. And, I think Ken Rogoff gave a very good interview about 2 weeks ago, sort of saying, look, if we're talking about a deficit of X or Y, or if we're talking about an inflation rate of X or Y versus getting your economy actually back to work again and people back to work and staving off a depression, then this is not the same debate that we used to have. So you could use this moment to have a massive investment in the kind of infrastructure we need, the green hydrogen and blue hydrogen infrastructure that we need, the kinds of deep refurbishment of buildings that we need so that we build efficiency into the economy, as well as then tilting the balance towards the infrastructure and the smart grid that you need for an economy which is going to be much more dependent upon electricity on the back end of this crisis. And then, of course, there's the role that the developed world is going to have to play in helping the developing world speed up its transition, and its transition also involves reliable, affordable, and clean energy for people who've never had it before. Why? Well, because they need it in order to be grown, but also because their health systems simply can't operate without it. But there is an opportunity to overcome our aversion to infrastructure and overcome our aversion to perhaps living with a slightly different balanced macroeconomic playbook in order to get that.
I'd like to go to Ethan and then Rich on this same question. Do you see bigger, bolder policies actually passing in the US Congress in the near term or not?
Short answer is...
We're counting on you for the answers here.
Look, there will be another stimulus bill, that seems likely. And the question then is what's going to be in it. And last week there was talk of it being infrastructure focused. And then by the end of the week, Nancy Pelosi was talking about it being more of a sequel to the last bill and not being so infrastructure focused. And I think obviously for the energy sector and clean energy sector in particular, we would like to see the emphasis on infrastructure. And with each bill that gets passed, it becomes more politically challenging to get the job done. I mean, the last one passed with basically literally zero opposition other than one, member of Congress from Kentucky. This one, next one around will be tougher. And then if there's another one after that, it's going to be even tougher after that. So you can see why there's a real push to want to get in this next package something pretty substantial. I will say this, which is that, there does seem to be some concern on the part of Democrats about allowing to being tarred with the so-called Green Deal. It just feels like that to me, and I kind of get that, and I do think that if they can, and if the clean energy sector can make the point that what clean energy is infrastructure writ large, valuable infrastructure, long-term investments in the types of things that we need, I think they'll potentially be more successful. And maybe just give one example, which is that I would argue that the clean energy sector, if you make basically zero interest loans available across the board, clean energy potentially has would potentially benefit more from that than would fossil energy. And that's because basically when you're talking about a clean energy project, 100% of the costs are upfront. They're CapEx costs. You build the project and then you have zero marginal costs of buying any kind of, you don't have to buy any coal or gas or anything. So it's all upfront. So a zero interest rate pays off the most for a clean energy project. So again, I think if clean energy can get in that jet stream of infrastructure, and the U.S., as Rachel says, if the U.S. is going to, is going to essentially print money and make money available at zero interest rates, I think the sector can benefit a lot from that. I would make one last really quick point, which is just that in the last major downturn we had, electricity demand fell very sharply, and then the economy grew for 10 years, but we did not have sort of a one-to-one growth in GDP and energy consumption. And so I think the hope and the goal here should be is if we are going to have some kind of a prolonged period of less demand, that as the economy grows, we don't necessarily have to get back to where we were. So let's not forget about energy efficiency and all the efforts that can and should be made now to make that as we rebuild, we don't necessarily have to get back to exactly where we were 2 months ago in terms of consumption levels. And I'm particularly talking about the US, which is a huge consumer of energy.
Great. So Rich, I'm going to go to you and add in the element of a question here from Joe Bryan at the Atlantic Council. He said, US and Europe are dependent on foreign or controlled sources for minerals and batteries to support EV production. So in the wake of COVID, do you expect governments and industry to take steps to strengthen domestic clean energy supply chains for batteries in particular? So both answer how bold policies will be, and if you see domestic manufacturing for EVs coming in there.
Sure. So I'll take those in two pieces. So first on how ambitious policy is going to be sort of going forward. I'm going to make a projection about this. And as Ethan in particular knows really well, the one thing we all know about the projections we make about the future is that it'll be dead wrong, right? But so I'll make it for the sake of argument. And so projection would be there will be at least 3 further stimulus bills. So there will be a bill in the very near term, probably when Congress gets back towards the end of April or early May, which does look a lot like a sequel of the last stimulus bill, which is heavily focused on keeping people home, but keeping them employed and paychecks coming and taking care of folks that have been laid off. That's not tactical, but surgical and focused in that way. Maybe on the same scale of the last one, sort of extensions of the Paycheck Protection Program and that sort of thing. And as in the last one, when a coalition of folks attempted to insert a package of clean energy incentives, probably ill-timed, that won't be really well received. And so I think that first one is going to be a very focused package just on relief. I think separately, there'll be a package that is a stimulus package, but it'll be labeled as an infrastructure package. And that's because there's already been a highway bill passed out of committee in the Senate. There's been a big proposal for an infrastructure bill in the House. There are sort of proposals on the table ready to go. Now, I suspect that they will be significantly scaled up in terms of overall ambition, but that the bills as they currently stand provide some roadmap, I guess pun intended, for where that infrastructure spending will go. And I agree with Ethan's point that there's quite a bit of opportunity in the clean energy space in infrastructure, sort of in the areas that we work on. We're going to need to build a lot of pipelines around this country if we're serious on dealing with carbon dioxide emissions. And those pipelines are either going to carry CO2 around the country that we've captured from industrial facilities and power plants, or they're going to carry hydrogen and renewable gas and syngas around the country. There's going to be all kinds of pipelines built. That's infrastructure. We clearly need more transmission lines. Hopefully, if something serious is done on transmission, it can sort of break through the NIMBY blockades that, for example, have been keeping great, Quebec hydro out of New York State and Massachusetts and all the other places that desperately want that clean energy, but are being sort of held up by all kinds of NIMBY concerns on the way down. I think there's actually a lot that can be done in pure regulatory reform and regulatory streamlining in that space. So it's not necessarily about the money. It might just be about pre-permitting the sequestration sites for the CO2 as it comes in, or pre-permitting, corridors for new transmission coming through. So I think that there's lots of opportunities there in that space. And then I do expect that there will be, beyond an infrastructure bill, broader economic stimuli, maybe, is that the plural of stimuli, bills down the road, because, I sort of agree with that. But this is going to be a long, deep, and very painful crisis. And I think the governments around the world are going to feel obliged to continue coming in the future. And so I think that there'll be opportunities in those bills as well, even beyond things that we would traditionally think of as infrastructure. And then last, Julia, to the question that was asked, I do think that we're going to see an increasing focus on supply chain resilience around the world. There were already terrific reasons out there to start diversifying the supply chains for a lot of these materials. Just look at the supply chain for cobalt and the very well documented issues with kind of artisanal mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and folks wanting to get away from these kind of sole source, often very problematic supply points. And so I think that will call for a renewed focus on mining and extracting and producing some of these rare earth materials in the United States and in other parts of the developed world. And there will be a renewed focus on innovative new technologies and chemistries and manufacturing techniques that find things that are less earth scarce. And that might be completely rethinking the concept of batteries for the grid and going after these many other ways to store energy that we know are out there, or it might be completely rethinking what the chemical makeup of a battery looks like. There are folks working on organic aqueous flow batteries that look a lot more like sugars and organic compounds than they do rare earths being used to store the electricity.
And we did see the Trump administration put some initiatives in place through the Department of Energy to try and make the supply chain more domestic.
That's right.
Battery
the Energy Storage Grand Challenge. That's right.
Right.
Yes.
Energy Storage Grand Challenge and other aspects. Great. So let's take a question from Stephen Lee at Bloomberg Environment. He asks, when this self-quarantine ends, people are going to be so fatigued and won't be in the mood to sacrifice more. Do you think that's a challenge to the adoption of clean energy among people who think it's a sacrifice? I'll put that to Adnan. Do you think that the fatigue will be a factor here in getting clean energy policies through?
I think that's a sort of thing that we've seen in normal times, that kind of reaction. And these are anything but normal times. And I think that there is going to be a very fundamental reassessment by people of how they see the world, how they interact with the world, what it means to be interconnected in the world in terms of a global pandemic or a global effort at sustainability. And I think as more information about the impact of a clean energy transition and its implications for the quality of life, especially if we can address just transition issues, how do we transition people in dirty industries into better, well-paying jobs, which are relevant to the new economy. I think that there will actually be enthusiasm to look at what the future looks like. And this goes back to the question which Rachel raised right at the beginning, which is the one of governance. And I think right now, and this is a global phenomenon, it's not just a US phenomenon, there is a sense among more and more people that somehow they are disempowered in terms of how the decision-making in their country is governed. And I think that there is going to be a reaction to that. So I think, there's a lot we can do to make that a positive, optimistic type of view of how we do this transition. But it also depends on how we present it. And, when we talk about infrastructure and people think about roads and bridges and so on, I ran an international organization, so I had a kind of first-hand view into policy in several of these countries. I participated in the five-year plan in China, in the renewable energy targets in the European Union, a lot of discussions in the US, in many emerging countries. And every country is beginning to look at this as an opportunity, not only for clean energy, and I've been told this by heads of state of countries, but as an opportunity to create a new form of economic growth with employment. I was told by President Sisi of Egypt, if I don't do renewables, I will have a major political problem because this is the only way I can begin to soak up the youth employment issue. where 1 million young people are coming into my labor market every year, and I don't have any possibility to provide them with a living. So I think that's the kind of thing we have to talk about. And then when we talk about infrastructure and innovation, let's make people excited about this. The Europeans have doubled down on this idea. They're going to invest in innovation. They're going to invest in their Green New Deal. They're putting a lot of money into hydrogen infrastructure. They're putting a lot of thinking into EVs. A lot of their big prestige manufacturers are retrofitting. Volkswagen is saying that from 2025 onwards, they will no longer be putting 1 cent into internal combustion engine platforms. And everybody is moving in that direction. A lot of innovation in batteries, a lot of investment in giga factories, bringing down the cost of batteries, and the same in China. I've been stunned by the quality of some of the new EVs coming out of China, which are not available internationally. They're just in the Chinese market. The investment they have in battery technology, Rich mentioned, new kind of battery chemistries. These guys are onto the 5th generation of lithium ion, where they have minimized cobalt and nickel unbelievably. I mean, there's like a 8-1-1 scenario with lithium, cobalt, and nickel. So I think batteries are changing, safety is increasing, energy density is increasing, and there's a lot of stuff happening. So in this kind of framework, where the research and development capabilities, the research institutions in the United States have traditionally had such tremendous global capability and have actually seeded a lot of this thinking in different parts of the world, need to be empowered in this next phase to, I think Rich mentioned 5 or 6 new programs on R&D that are being put forward. I think this is where investment needs to happen, especially as well as smart infrastructure, smart grids, integration.
Jump in there quickly, and because I think we could discuss a lot more about where. No, thank you very much about the opportunities here. I'm just going to push back and say, maybe tactically putting this to Ethan, how realistic is it that the US and the EU will meet their declared renewable energy targets, including states? Will it be possible for them in this environment in the near term to hit those targets? That's a question from Elliot Roseman.
Yeah, so first, look here, and just to back up for a second, in terms of what we at BNF are saying is, and to Anand's point earlier, I personally think this is going to be very severe as well. I think for us, though, the challenge for us is to try and model a scenario. And the first one we can model is short-term major disruption. Well, longer-term massive disruption is harder to do, but to be clear, to the point earlier, those are sort of what my comments have been around. But if we are looking at a more prolonged period in which overall demand for electricity continues to be lower, and we've seen it drop by 15-20% in New York City, for instance, already, then that raises all kinds of different kinds of questions. And I think one of them is regarding renewable portfolio standards, the state level targets. I mean, ironically enough, one of the fastest ways to get to a higher percentage of clean energy is to reduce the overall demand for electricity. The focus all along on our renewable portfolio standards have been on essentially the numerator in the fraction, so raising the number so you can get to 100%. But if you reduce the denominator, which is the total amount of use, then your percentage of clean energy is going up, and we're seeing that happen in Europe, and the same is true in the United States, because renewable energy essentially has zero marginal cost once it comes online, and so it will always get dispatched. And so this is, interestingly enough, I could make the case that there'll be some states where they may want to revisit being more aggressive on some of their clean energy targets if this becomes a prolonged period of time. But I want to make one real quick other point before I surrender the floor here to Stephen's question earlier about this question around sacrifice. First of all, let me make the point that I don't think clean energy is actually a sacrifice. Go for a drive in an electric vehicle and you tell me if the experience has been a sacrifice for you compared to driving a internal combustion engine car. I would be surprised if you think that. But the second thing is, and trying to put some optimistic spin on this overall, is I do think it's possible that out of all of this that consumers and all of us have more of a personal understanding of the concept of resilience and wanting to become more personally energy self-sufficient. And so while right now nobody is feeling flush with cash to put a residential photovoltaic system on their roof or buy a battery, they might, when they come out the end of this process, feel like, wow, shit happens, and when it does next time, I better be ready for it in a more meaningful way than I was, besides just hoarding toilet paper and putting it in my basement. And then the last thing, again, optimistically thinking about all of this, is frankly coming into this, there were a lot of people who did not believe in climate change and still don't. And I take that as a proxy for not really believing in the fundamental tenets of science. And if you were whistling past the graveyard and sort of saying, oh, this whole thing is a hoax and it's not real and it's, and it's been cooked up by the left-wing media or whatever, well, frankly, sadly, if you've lost a loved one or a friend, then it is a reminder to you that science is real, and sometimes it can come along and really bite you in the ass. And maybe if we're, trying to take an optimistic view of this, maybe that will get people to take a more serious look at climate change and all the warnings that our many esteemed scientists have been making for years now, and in many cases have not been listened to.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask about the oil industry. We know that industry leaders met with President Trump and leaders at the White House on Friday. Is it reasonable for the industry to ask for assistance at this time? And are there lessons from this kind of interaction that clean energy stakeholders could take away from this? I guess, Dean Kite, I'll go to you first. Is there a role for propping up and supporting the oil and gas industry through this?
Well, it depends what you're propping them up for. I mean, clearly the oil and gas companies have great technical competence. They operate globally, regionally, whatever. They are big employers. They, for the moment, they are, mainstays of the economy in certain parts of the country and the world. So and I take all of the comments about the likelihood of things being in stimulus packages 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, right? And I don't disagree with a lot of what's been said. But if you ask me the question, could they, should they, and would they be supported? Then there is a way to support them, with a conditionality, which is that they are committed to the 2030 and 2050 sort of milestones that we have to be on for a decarbonized economy. And that it wouldn't just be for the oil and gas companies. That would also apply to the airline industry, for example. I mean, yes, you get supported out, but here are the things we want you to do in governance. Here are the things we want you to do in terms of your fuel mix and your efficiency. And here are the things we want you to do in terms of social responsibility. The state can say you can't have public money. So these cruise lines, bail out a cruise line, but then don't go register yourself in a tax haven. And when the times are good, it all goes to you. When times are bad, you come to the public purse. So I think that, you need the leading edge of the oil and gas companies to be committed to that point on the horizon to which we've all agreed, which is a decarbonized global economy before 2050. Actually, you want them to be very aggressive in the next 10 years. In the midst of this earthquake of Saudi-Russia roulette and then the coronavirus crisis. Will this administration want to do that? Is the US power politics ready to do that? That's a separate question. But could we? Yes, we could. We could support them to be a part of a technological transition. The other thing I'd say is that whatever you think about the oil and gas industry, the fact that if you get a meeting at the White House, you get a test was not lost on a large part of the American public. And on the back end of this crisis, when everybody has to be vaccinated, a country where favors will be given out as opposed to a blanket public vaccination program will not come out of the crisis as quickly as the one that has the vaccine free for everybody.
Well, there's plenty more questions here I wish we could get to. I think I'll just have to turn down our final minutes to have closing remarks. And I'll add the final twist of, if you have thoughts on this, how do you see these issues playing into the US presidential election? Huge question. You only get a couple minutes, but you're all experts, so I think you can do it. Rich, I'll start with you, please.
Well, I'm not a US citizen, so I don't have a dog in the fight, but I would hope that at some point when the election sort of gets vamped up again, these are the issues that get debated. These were not the issues that were being debated before the crisis. And it would be great if we could have some public pressure and some media pressure actually to actually have that be the debate. I hold very little hope for that, but whoever takes over in November has got, I think, many years of recession or not depression, and a global set of relationships that will have to be rebuilt in that new world. So it's a big job for whoever wins.
With our last minute, Rich, then we'll go Adnan and Ethan to close us out.
Well, I think it's it's impossible to believe that this election won't sort of hinge on who's got the more compelling case for economic recovery coming out of all this, particularly in a lot of the states that have sort of become our battleground states. Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, places like this, and so I think it's going to hinge on who has the most compelling case about sort of putting a lot of those, folks back to work in manufacturing and heavy industry and a lot of these other things. And, ideally, whatever way we do that, we'll do that in a way that, pushes a clean energy forward.
Adnan?
My very strong feeling is, unfortunately, this current crisis is going to be very severe here in the US. And I think the central issue in the election will be the handling by the administration of this crisis. If people have confidence in that or not, how we come out of it, that's going to be the central issue. And the other is, as Rich says, going to be, are we going to have a job? What's going to be our income? Where's the economy going? Do we have a positive perspective in the future? And if you look at the energy sector, and this is the oil question, if you look at the market value of what has been happening to the oil majors, it's been carnage. I mean, Exxon has lost half its market value, Shell, billions of dollars of market valuation disappearing, service companies like Schlumberger losing $30 billion, $40 billion. They're on a downward trajectory in terms of market value. And instead of looking at those industries that could potentially provide the employment and revenue generation of the future, we want to double down on defending an industry where the twilight is becoming obvious. I mean, if you look at the Saudi position on oil.
I'm going to have to cut you off there only because we're out of time. Ethan, 30 seconds around us out here. Thank you.
All I can say is it'd be nice if there's a lot of conversation about climate during this presidential campaign, but this is fundamentally going to be a referendum on how well this administration did or did not handle the COVID crisis, and everything else will be second by far.
Great. All right. We'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much to our speakers for taking the time to share their insights. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center for putting on this event. Also, the Atlantic Council Communications and Events teams, you made this event possible. Special shout out to Zachary Strauss for your help with event preparation. If you're looking for more analysis on what COVID-19 means for climate and clean energy, join the Global Energy Center this Wednesday, April 8th from 12:45 to 1:45 p.m. Eastern Time for a virtual fireside chat with Francesco La Camera, Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency. He'll be discussing the future of renewable energy in a post-pandemic world. So register for that on the Atlantic Council website. Thank you for now, and until next time.